The sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, beating down upon the endless prairie that stretched beyond the horizon like a golden sea. Heat waves shimmered above the parched earth, distorting the distant shapes of buffalo grass and sagebrush. A lone hawk circled overhead, its shadow dancing across the rutted wagon trail that cut through this desolate expanse like a scar. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing its passengers against one another as wheels found yet another pothole in the dusty road. Inside, Elizabeth Hartley pressed a lace handkerchief to her perspiring forehead, wondering for the 100th time if she had made a terrible mistake. The delicate fabric of her traveling dress, once a pristine dove gray, now bore the evidence of 3 days' journey from Independence dust, sweat, and the stubborn optimism of a woman fleeing everything she had ever known. "Almost there, miss," the driver called down, his voice rough as the landscape itself. "Clearwater's just over that ridge." Elizabeth peered through the small window, squinting against the glare. Clearwater. Even the name seemed like a cruel joke in this parched land. She had imagined something quite different when she'd answered the advertisement for a schoolteacher, perhaps a quaint frontier town with whitewashed buildings and friendly faces eager for education and refinement. What materialized before her eyes as they crested the hill was something else entirely. The town sprawled haphazardly across a shallow valley, a collection of weathered wooden structures that seemed to huddle together for protection against the vastness surrounding them. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their painted signs already fading in the harsh sun. Dust devils danced between the structures, and she could see figures moving slowly in the heat, their forms indistinct and somehow menacing. As the stagecoach rumbled down the main street, Elizabeth observed the townspeople with growing unease. Rough men in worn clothes paused to stare, their eyes following the coach with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. Women in calico dresses gathered their children close, whispering behind raised hands. Everyone, it seemed, moved with a peculiar wariness, as if constantly prepared for some unnamed threat. The coach jerked to a stop before a 2-story building bearing a crooked sign, Clearwater Hotel. Elizabeth gathered her courage along with her carpet bag and stepped down into the street, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. The heat hit her like a physical blow, so different from the humid summers of Philadelphia she had left behind. "Miss Hartley," a thin man in a threadbare suit approached, mopping his brow with a gray handkerchief. "I'm Silas Morrison, head of the school board. We've been expecting you." His smile didn't reach his eyes, which darted nervously toward the edge of town. Elizabeth followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. There, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, sat a lone rider on a paint horse. Even from this distance, she could tell he was different from the townspeople, his posture proud and still, like a statue carved from the landscape itself. His long dark hair caught the wind, and though she couldn't make out his features, she felt the weight of his gaze upon her. "Don't mind him," Morrison said quickly, taking her elbow and steering her toward the hotel. "The Lakota come to trade sometimes. Best to keep your distance." Lakota Elizabeth had heard stories, of course wild tales of savage warriors and bloody raids. But the figure on the horse looked neither wild nor savage, merely watchful. "Indians," Morrison clarified unnecessarily, his voice dropping. "We have an uneasy peace, but it's best not to test it. Come, let's get you settled." The hotel room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the street. Elizabeth unpacked slowly, her movements mechanical as her mind processed the reality of her new home. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices, men arguing about cattle prices, a woman scolding a child, the clink of bottles from what must be a saloon nearby. As evening approached, she ventured downstairs to the dining room, where Morrison had promised to meet her for supper. The room fell silent as she entered, a dozen pairs of eyes turning to assess the newcomer. She lifted her chin and walked to an empty table with as much dignity as she could muster. "You're the new schoolmarm," a woman stated rather than asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Mrs. Walsh. I run the general store with my husband." "Elizabeth Hartley," she replied, grateful for even this brusque welcome. "I'm pleased to meet you." "Are you now, Mrs.?" Walsh's expression suggested skepticism. "Wait until you've been here a month. See if you're still pleased then." Before Elizabeth could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats sent people rushing to the windows. Through the glass, Elizabeth saw a group of riders galloping down the main street, whooping and firing pistols into the air. Her heart hammered as she recognized the type outlaws, the kind her Philadelphia friends had warned her about with delicious horror. "Damn Coulter gang," someone muttered, "getting bolder every day." The riders wheeled their horses in the street, laughing at the townspeople who scattered before them. One of them, a bearded man with cold eyes, seemed to be their leader. He scanned the buildings with proprietary arrogance before his gaze landed on the hotel windows. Elizabeth shrank back instinctively. "They've been terrorizing folks for months." "Mrs." Walsh said quietly, "taking what they want, when they want. The sheriff does what he can, but—" She shrugged eloquently. As quickly as they had come, the outlaws spurred their horses and rode out, leaving a cloud of dust and fear in their wake. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. What had she gotten herself into? That night, sleep eluded her. Every sound, the creak of wood settling, the distant howl of a coyote, the muffled voices from the saloon kept her tense and alert. She had left Philadelphia to escape the suffocating expectations of society, the pressure to marry a man she didn't love, the constrained life mapped out for her from birth. But lying in this narrow bed in this harsh, dangerous place, she wondered if she had traded one prison for another. Just before dawn, she rose and went to the window. The town lay still and gray in the pre-dawn light, but movement caught her eye. The Lakota rider was there again, closer this time, walking his horse slowly down the main street. As he passed beneath her window, he looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. His face was younger than she had expected, weathered but handsome in a way that had nothing to do with the soft features prized in Philadelphia society. There was something in his dark eyes, not threat, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw through her proper Eastern facade to the woman who had risked everything for freedom. Then he was gone, vanishing into the growing light like a dream. Elizabeth pressed her fingers to the cool glass, her heart beating with something that wasn't quite fear. In that brief moment, she had felt less alone than she had since boarding the train in Philadelphia. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew, as dangerous as the land itself. But as the sun rose over the prairie, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson, she couldn't bring herself to wish it away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Elizabeth made her way to the general store. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival in Clearwater, and the initial shock had given way to a stubborn determination to make this place work. The schoolhouse, a single room on the edge of town, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in teaching the handful of children whose parents dared to dream of something better for them. She was examining bolts of fabric when the door burst open, bells jangling violently. A man stumbled in, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. Elizabeth recognized him as Jake Thompson, one of the local ranchers who spent more time in the saloon than on his land. "Where's that red devil?" Thompson slurred, scanning the store with bloodshot eyes. "Saw him come in here." "Mrs." Walsh emerged from behind the counter, her expression stern. "If you're looking for trouble, Jake, you can take it elsewhere." "That savage cheated me." Thompson's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "Traded me a lame horse, and I aim to get satisfaction." Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she heard footsteps from the back room. The Lakota warrior she had seen that first morning stepped into view, his movements deliberate and calm. She had learned his name, Samuel White Eagle, though most in town simply called him the Indian, with varying degrees of contempt or fear. Up close, she could see the marks of his life etched into his features, a thin scar across his left cheekbone, lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into far horizons, and something else, a weariness that seemed too heavy for someone who couldn't be more than 30 winters. "The horse was sound when you traded for it," White Eagle said, his English careful but clear. "What you did after is not my concern." Thompson's face darkened. "You calling me a liar, boy?" The word hung in the air like a challenge. Elizabeth saw White Eagle's jaw tighten, but his voice remained level. "I speak only truth. The horse was good. You rode it too hard, too drunk. Now you blame me for your foolishness." "Why, you—" Thompson's hand closed on his pistol grip. Without thinking, Elizabeth stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, surely this can be settled without violence." Her finishing school voice rang with an authority she didn't feel. "Perhaps if we could examine the horse together." "Stay out of this, schoolmarm," Thompson snarled. "This is between me and this thieving redskin." "The only thief here," White Eagle said quietly, "is the man who takes what is not his and calls it civilization." The words cut deeper than any blade. Thompson's face went purple, and he yanked his pistol free, but White Eagle was already moving, fluid as water, knocking the gun aside. It discharged harmlessly into the floor, the sound deafening in the small space. Sheriff Coleman burst through the door moments later, taking in the scene with weary eyes. "Thompson, you're drunk again. Get out of here before I lock you up." "He attacked me," Thompson protested. "You all saw it." "I saw you draw on an unarmed man, Mrs.," Walsh said firmly. "Now get out of my store." Thompson left, but not before shooting a venomous look at White Eagle. "This ain't over, Savage. Not by a long shot." After the sheriff had escorted Thompson away, an uncomfortable silence settled over the store. White Eagle straightened his vest, a curious blend of traditional beadwork and frontier practicality, and turned to leave. "Wait," Elizabeth heard herself say. He paused, looking back with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Thank you for not— that is, you could have hurt him, but you didn't." Something flickered across his face, surprise. "Perhaps—" "Violence solves nothing," he said. "It only feeds more violence, like a fire that consumes everything." He studied her for a moment. "You are the teacher." It wasn't a question, but she nodded. "Elizabeth Hartley." "I know who you are." His gaze held hers. "You stood between us. That was brave, foolish, but brave." Heat rose to her cheeks. "I couldn't just stand by?" "Most do." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a statement of fact. "Your students are fortunate." He left before she could respond, moving with that same fluid grace that made him seem part of the landscape itself. "Mrs." Walsh bustled over, clucking her tongue. "You best be careful, Miss Hartley. Getting involved in such matters, it's not wise." "He was defending himself," Elizabeth said, surprised by her own vehemence. "That may be, but folks here have long memories and short tempers. That young man carries more weight than just his own." "Mrs." Walsh's voice dropped. "Lost his whole family to soldiers when he was just a boy. Massacre at Sand Creek. They say, only survivor of his band. The Lakota took him in, raised him as their own. But he walks between worlds now, not fully trusted by either side." Elizabeth felt something twist in her chest. She knew what it was like to be caught between worlds, though her circumstances were far gentler than his. That afternoon, as she taught arithmetic to her small class, she found her thoughts returning to the encounter. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see the vast prairie stretching endlessly, and she wondered where White Eagle went when he left town. Did he have a home, a family? Or was he as alone as she sometimes felt herself to be? Young Mary Coleman, the sheriff's daughter, raised her hand. "Miss Hartley, why do some folks hate the Indians so much?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. She looked at the expectant faces, children of ranchers, shopkeepers, even one whose father had been killed in a raid 2 years past, and chose her words carefully. "Fear," she said finally. "People often hate what they fear, and they fear what they don't understand." "But Samuel White Eagle doesn't seem scary," piped up Tommy Morrison, the school board chairman's son. "He helped Pa fix our wagon wheel last month." "Then, perhaps," Elizabeth said gently, "we should try to understand rather than fear." It was a dangerous lesson in a town like Clearwater, but one she believed in her bones. That evening, as she walked back to the hotel, she saw him again. White Eagle sat his paint horse at the edge of town, silhouetted against the setting sun. This time, she raised her hand in greeting. After a moment's hesitation, he touched his fingers to his hat brim in response, a gesture both foreign and familiar. As she prepared for bed that night, Elizabeth reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had come west seeking freedom from society's constraints, only to find different but equally rigid boundaries. Yet there were cracks in those boundaries, moments of possibility, in the way White Eagle had stayed his hand when he could have struck, in the children who questioned the hatred they saw around them, in a simple greeting exchanged at sunset. She thought of his words, "Violence only feeds more violence." There was wisdom there, hard-won and painful. She wondered what horrors he had seen to learn that lesson, what losses he had endured, misses. Walsh had mentioned Sand Creek. Elizabeth had heard whispers of that dark day even in Philadelphia, though the newspapers had painted it differently. Outside her window, a coyote howled, and others answered, their voices weaving together in a wild harmony. The sound no longer frightened her as it had those first nights. Instead, it seemed to speak of something essential about this place, lonely but not alone, harsh but not without beauty, dangerous but not without hope. Tomorrow, she would teach again, would face the suspicious looks and whispered comments that followed her defense of White Eagle. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine a different West one where understanding could bridge the chasms between peoples, where a woman could choose her own path, where a man caught between worlds might find a place to belong. They were dangerous dreams in a dangerous land. But as Elizabeth drifted towards sleep, she held them close anyway, like seeds that might, against all odds, take root in the unforgiving soil of the frontier. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful Saturday afternoon like glass. Elizabeth had been in the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the coming week, when the sound of galloping horses and men's shouts sent her to the window. What she saw made her blood run cold. The Coulter gang had returned in force. At least a dozen riders thundered down Main Street, their face masked with bandanas, firing their weapons into the air and at windows. Townsfolk scattered like leaves before a storm, mothers grabbing children, men diving for cover. The peaceful town transformed into chaos in seconds. Elizabeth's first instinct was to bar the door and hide, but through the window she saw little Sarah Walsh, Mrs. Walsh's granddaughter, frozen with terror in the middle of the street as horses bore down on her. Without thinking, Elizabeth burst from the schoolhouse and ran toward the child. The thunder of hooves filled her ears. She scooped Sarah into her arms and dove for the sidewalk just as the riders swept past. So close she could smell the leather and sweat. One of the outlaws laughed, a cold sound that chilled her despite the heat. "Everyone in the bank," the leader's voice rang out. She recognized it as belonging to Tom Coulter himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about even in a hard place like Clearwater. "Anyone tries to be a hero, they'll be measuring them for a pine box." Elizabeth pressed herself and Sarah against the wall of the mercantile as the outlaws dismounted. Half went into the bank while the others stood guard, weapons trained on the windows and doorways where townspeople cowered. She could see Sheriff Coleman pinned down behind a water trough, outgunned and outmanned. A movement at the edge of town caught her eye. Samuel White Eagle sat on his horse near the livery stable, perfectly still, watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw him make a decision. He dismounted in one fluid motion and moved toward the scene, not directly but along the sides of buildings, using shadows and cover. Inside the bank, she could hear shouting, the crash of furniture. One of the guards noticed White Eagle's approach and swung his rifle toward him. Well, looks like we got us an Indian trying to play hero. I want no trouble, White Eagle said, hands visible but ready. Let the people go. Tom Coulter emerged from the bank, saddlebags bulging. He was a big man with dead eyes and a scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. Indians should mind their own business, he said, drawing his pistol. Unless you want to join your ancestors real quick. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Elizabeth could see other townspeople watching from windows and doorways, but none moved to help. The outlaws were too many, too well armed. It would be a massacre. Then Jake Thompson stumbled from the saloon, still drunk from the morning's binge. He saw White Eagle facing down the outlaws and laughed bitterly. Let him shoot the savage one less redskin to worry about. The distraction was all Coulter needed. His gun swung toward Thompson. Shut your mouth, drunk, or... White Eagle moved. In the space between heartbeats, he had crossed the distance and knocked Coulter's gun hand aside. The shot went wild, splintering wood from the saloon wall. The two men grappled, but Coulter was bigger, stronger. He drove a knee into White Eagle's ribs and raised his gun again. No! The word tore from Elizabeth's throat as she started forward. But she was too far away. Too late. Another figure burst from cover. Sheriff Coleman, taking advantage of the distraction, got the drop on two of the guards. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Elizabeth pulled Sarah behind a water barrel as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Through the chaos, she saw White Eagle and Coulter still struggling. The outlaw had his hands around the warrior's throat, forcing him to his knees. White Eagle's face was darkening, his struggles weakening. Elizabeth looked around desperately and spotted a shovel leaning against the wall. Without letting herself think, she grabbed it and ran toward the fighting men. Coulter was so focused on choking the life from White Eagle that he didn't see her coming. She swung the shovel with all her strength, catching him across the shoulders. He released White Eagle and spun toward her with a snarl. You little... He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling in the dust. Stars exploded across her vision as she tasted blood. Coulter loomed over her, gun rising. A hand shot out and gripped Coulter's wrist with crushing force. White Eagle, on his feet despite his injured throat, spoke in a voice rough as gravel but carrying absolute conviction. Your hands off my woman. The words hung in the air for a moment of perfect stillness. Then White Eagle yanked Coulter forward and in the same motion pulled Elizabeth against him, shielding her with his body as one of Coulter's men fired. She felt him jerk as the bullet struck, heard his sharp intake of breath, but he didn't fall. Sheriff Coleman and several armed townsmen had rallied now. The tide was turning. Coulter, seeing his advantage lost, whistled sharply. Pull back everyone out. The outlaws fought a retreating action toward their horses. Coulter himself was the last to mount, and as he did, he pointed at White Eagle and Elizabeth. This ain't over, Breed. You just signed your death warrant, yours and your woman's both. They galloped out of town in a cloud of dust and gun smoke, leaving destruction in their wake. Elizabeth found herself still pressed against White Eagle's chest, could feel the rapid beat of his heart, the warmth spreading across his shirt that could only be blood. You're hurt, she said, pulling back to look at him. The bullet had torn through his upper arm, and blood was flowing freely. It is nothing, he said, but his face had paled beneath its bronze tone. He looked down at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You should not have risked yourself. Neither should you. She was suddenly aware that half the town was watching them, that his arms were still around her, that he had called her his woman. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she didn't step away. "We need to get you to the doctor." "No doctor will treat an Indian," he said matter-of-factly. "Then I will." The words came out fiercer than she intended. She looked around at the watching townspeople, daring them to object. "Mrs." Walsh stepped forward with bandages and a nod of approval. Even Sheriff Coleman, nursing his own grazes, didn't protest. As Elizabeth led White Eagle toward the schoolhouse, supporting him when he swayed, she heard the whispers starting behind them. She knew what they were saying, knew that by tomorrow she would be the woman who had chosen a savage over her own kind. Her position as teacher might be forfeit. Her reputation certainly was. But as she helped him sit on the steps and began cleaning his wound with gentle hands, she found she didn't care. He had risked his life when he could have ridden away. He had shielded her with his own body, and in that moment when death had seemed certain, he had claimed her as his to protect. "Why?" she asked quietly as she worked. "Why did you say what you said?" His dark eyes met hers, and for once there was no wall between them, no careful distance. "Because it was true," he said simply. "From the moment you stood between Thompson and me, defending what was right though it gained you nothing, from the moment you raised your hand in greeting instead of turning away, you became mine to protect, as I became yours." Her hands stilled on the bandage. The rational part of her mind, the part raised in Philadelphia society, told her this was madness. They were from different worlds, different peoples. It could never work. But her heart, the part that had driven her west seeking freedom and truth, recognized something fundamental in his words. In this violent land where civilization was a thin veneer over savage reality, they had found something worth fighting for in each other. "The townspeople won't accept it," she said softly. "They do not have to." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "But Coulter will return. He will seek revenge. You are in danger now because of me." "I was in danger the moment I stepped off that stagecoach," Elizabeth replied. "At least now I'm not facing it alone." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No," he agreed. "Not alone." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Elizabeth finished binding his wound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Coulter would return. The town would judge, and the harsh realities of frontier life would continue. But for now, in this moment suspended between violence and peace, between two worlds finding common ground, she allowed herself to believe that love might be strong enough to bridge any divide even here, in this unforgiving land where hope was as precious and rare as water in the desert. The morning after the raid dawned gray and subdued, as if the very sky mourned the violence of the day before. Elizabeth stood before the cracked mirror in her hotel room, examining the purple bruise that painted the left side of her face where Coulter had struck her. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair, but her resolve remained steady. The hotel dining room fell silent when she entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and every eye tracked her movement to an empty table. She had expected this, had steeled herself for it during the sleepless night, but the weight of their judgment still pressed against her like a physical thing. "Mrs." Walsh appeared at her elbow with a pot of coffee, her expression unreadable. "How's the arm?" she asked quietly. "He'll heal," Elizabeth replied, grateful for even this small kindness. "The wound was clean." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Mrs." Walsh poured the coffee with steady hands. "You've chosen a hard road, girl." Before Elizabeth could respond, Silas Morrison approached her table, his thin face pinched with disapproval. "Miss Hartley, I think we need to discuss your actions yesterday." "My actions?" Elizabeth kept her voice level. "You mean when I helped save this town from outlaws?" "I mean," Morrison's voice dropped to a hiss, "when you threw yourself at that savage in front of the entire town, when you took him to the schoolhouse alone, when you allowed him to claim you." Heat rose in Elizabeth's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Morrison, Samuel White Eagle risked his life defending this town. He took a bullet meant for me. The least I could do was tend his wounds." "The least you could do," Morrison countered, "is remember your position. You're here to teach our children proper civilized values, not to consort with Indians." "And what values would those be?" Elizabeth set down her cup with careful precision. "To stand by while innocent people are threatened, to let a man bleed because of the color of his skin. If those are the values you want taught, then perhaps you need a different teacher." Morrison's face flushed. "Perhaps we do. The school board will meet this evening to discuss your continued employment." He stalked away, leaving Elizabeth alone with her cooling coffee and the weight of watching eyes. She had known this was coming, had accepted it the moment she'd chosen to help White Eagle. But the reality still stung. She spent the morning at the schoolhouse, teaching her small group of students with determined normalcy, but even the children seemed subdued, casting nervous glances her way. Only young Mary Coleman met her eyes directly. "My PA says you were brave yesterday," Mary whispered during arithmetic. "He says Mr. White Eagle was brave too." It was a small comfort, but Elizabeth held onto it like a lifeline. That afternoon, as she was dismissing the children, she saw a familiar figure approaching on foot. White Eagle moved carefully, his injured arm bound in a sling, but his stride was steady. The children scattered at his approach, all except Mary, who gave him a shy smile before running home. "You should be resting," Elizabeth said, fighting the urge to check his bandages. Rest comes hard when storm clouds gather. He studied her face, his expression darkening at the sight of her bruise. "I have brought trouble to you." "Trouble was already here. You just gave it a target." She gestured toward the schoolhouse. "Would you like to come in? People are already talking, might as well give them something true to discuss." A wry smile touched his lips. "You have courage, Elizabeth Hartley." Inside the schoolhouse, with afternoon light slanting through the windows, the outside world seemed briefly held at bay. Elizabeth busied herself straightening already neat desks, while White Eagle examined the books and maps on her shelves. "You teach them about my people?" he asked, touching a map that showed tribal territories. "I try to teach them truth, when I can find it. Most of what's written—" She shrugged helplessly. "It's not accurate, is it? History is written by those who win." He turned from the map. "But you try. That matters." They stood facing each other in the quiet room, and Elizabeth felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them. The claim he had made, the choice she had made, the uncertain future that stretched before them. "Coulter will return," White Eagle said finally. "He is like a rabid wolf. He cannot let challenge pass. I should leave, draw him away from here." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Running won't solve anything. You said it yourself, violence feeds violence. If we give in to fear, if we let men like Coulter drive us apart, then what hope is there for any of us?" He moved closer, his good hand rising to hover near her bruised cheek, not quite touching. "You would stand with me knowing what it costs." "I've already paid that price." She caught his hand, pressing it gently to her face. "The question is whether you'll stand with me." His thumb brushed featherlight over her bruise, until the mountains crumbled to dust. A commotion outside shattered the moment. Through the window, Elizabeth saw a crowd gathering in the street. At its center stood Jake Thompson and several other men, their faces ugly with drink and righteous anger. "We know you're in there. Breed," Thompson shouted. "Come out and face justice." "Justice!" Elizabeth yanked open the door, fury overcoming caution. "What justice? The justice of a mob." "Get back inside, woman," Thompson snarled. "This ain't your concern anymore. The school board met early. You're finished here. No Indian lover is teaching our children." The words hit like physical blows, but Elizabeth stood her ground. "If standing against ignorance and hatred makes me unfit to teach, Then I accept your judgment. But I won't stand by while you murder an innocent man." "Innocent?" Another man spat in the dirt. "He's an Indian. That's crime enough." White Eagle appeared beside her, his presence solid and calm despite the danger. "If you want me, I am here, but I will not run, and I will not hide. I have done nothing but defend this town and its people." "You contaminated a white woman," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "I protected someone who showed me kindness." White Eagle replied, "If that is a crime in your eyes, then your law means nothing." Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. "That's enough, everyone disperse, now." "You taking his side, Sheriff?" Thompson demanded. "I'm taking the side of law and order." Coleman replied, "This man fought against the Coulter gang. That makes him one of the good guys in my book. Now move along before I start making arrests." The crowd grumbled but began to break up under Coleman's stern gaze. Thompson was the last to go, but not before pointing at Elizabeth and White Eagle. "This ain't over," he promised. "Not by a long shot." As the street cleared, Coleman turned to them with weary eyes. "He's right. You know, this won't end well. The town's divided. Some think you're heroes. Others think you're a threat to everything they believe in." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Elizabeth asked. Coleman was quiet for a long moment. "I think you're two people who found each other in a hard place. Seen stranger things work out. Seen simpler things fail. But you need to be careful. Word is Coulter's gathering more men. He'll come back. And when he does, he'll come for you both." After the sheriff left, Elizabeth and White Eagle stood together in the gathering dusk. The schoolhouse, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Her position was gone, her reputation in tatters. Yet looking at the man beside her, wounded for her sake, standing firm despite the hatred directed at him, she felt no regret. "Where will you go?" White Eagle asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have some money saved. Perhaps another town." "Come with me." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elizabeth's heart raced as she considered what he was offering, not just shelter, but a complete break from the world she knew. "Your people, would they accept me?" "My people judge by actions, not blood. You stood for what was right. That speaks louder than skin color." Outside, night was falling over Clearwater, bringing with it the familiar sounds of a frontier town, distant piano music from the saloon, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind across the prairie. But now these sounds seemed to belong to another world, one that had already rejected her. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll come with you." In his eyes, she saw reflected her own mixture of fear and hope. They were choosing each other over everything else: safety, acceptance, the familiar paths their lives might have taken. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As they made plans to leave at dawn, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had come west seeking freedom, and in the strangest way possible, she had found it. Not the freedom she had imagined, not the simple independence of a schoolteacher in a frontier town, but something deeper and more dangerous. The freedom to choose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, an uncertain future with someone who saw her truly over a safe life among those who would never accept who she really was. The bruise on her face throbbed, reminding her of the violence that had brought them together and the violence that still threatened. But as White Eagle helped her gather her few possessions, his presence steady and sure despite his injury, she knew she had made the only choice her heart would allow. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, but tonight, under the vast western stars that watched without judgment, two souls from different worlds had found in each other a home worth fighting for. The dust cloud on the horizon was their first warning. Elizabeth, helping to prepare the evening meal in the Lakota camp where White Eagle had brought her 3 days prior, felt the change in the air before she saw anything. The women around her stiffened, hands pausing in their work, eyes turning toward the prairie where riders approached like a dark storm. "How many?" asked Morningstar. The elderly woman who had taken Elizabeth under her wing despite the wary looks from others in the camp. White Eagle appeared from the horse herd, his movements swift despite his healing arm. "Too many," he said grimly. "Coulter has brought an army." Elizabeth counted at least 20 riders, maybe more. Her heart sank as she recognized the lead figure, Tom Coulter himself, his scarred face visible even at this distance. They had found refuge with White Eagle's adopted people, but now that refuge would become a battlefield. "We should run," suggested a young warrior named Red Crow. "Take the women and children into the hills." "No." Chief Standing Bear, a man whose weathered face spoke of countless battles survived, stepped forward. "We run from no one. This is our land." White Eagle touched Elizabeth's arm. "You should go with the others. This is not your fight." "It became my fight the moment I stood with you," she replied, though fear made her voice tremble. "I won't leave now." The riders stopped just outside the camp, spreading out in a semicircle. Coulter rode forward, flanked by his lieutenants. Elizabeth recognized several faces from Clearwater men who had chosen greed over law. Well, Coulter called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Looks like the breed found himself a whole nest of savages to hide behind." Standing Bear stepped forward, his dignity unshaken by the insult. "You are not welcome here. Leave now, and there will be no blood." Coulter laughed, an ugly sound. "I don't take orders from Indians. Old man, I came for what's mine, the breed and his woman. Hand them over, and maybe we'll let the rest of you live." "They are under our protection," Standing Bear replied firmly. "To take them, you must go through us." "Fine by me." Coulter's hand moved to his gun. "Been too long since I had myself a good Indian hunt." The tension stretched taut, violence hanging in the air like smoke before a fire. Elizabeth saw hands moving to weapons on both sides, saw women quietly gathering children and moving them toward the center of camp. Her medical supplies were in the teepee. She would be needed soon. "Wait." White Eagle stepped forward, placing himself between the two groups. "This quarrel is between Coulter and me. Let us settle it without bloodshed." "Samuel, no," Elizabeth breathed, but he didn't look back. "You want to face me alone. Breed." Coulter's scarred mouth twisted into a grin. "Without your woman to save you with a shovel." Laughter rippled through the outlaws. White Eagle remained steady. "Single combat. If I win, you and your men leave and never return. If you win," he paused, "you get what you came for." "No," Elizabeth started forward, but Morningstar caught her arm with surprising strength. "Trust him," the old woman whispered. "He knows what he does." Coulter dismounted, handing his rifle to one of his men. "Just knives, then. Wouldn't want anyone saying I didn't give a savage a fair chance." They cleared a circle in the dust between the camp and the outlaws. Elizabeth watched with her heart in her throat as White Eagle checked his injured arm, testing its movement. It had healed well, but she knew it still pained him. Against Coulter, larger and uninjured, he would need every advantage. The two men circled each other like predators. Coulter struck first, his blade flashing in the dying light. White Eagle flowed aside, the movement liquid and controlled. They engaged in a deadly dance, steel ringing against steel, dust rising around them. Coulter was strong and brutal, using his size to try to overpower his opponent. But White Eagle fought like his namesake, swift, precise, using Coulter's strength against him. Still, Elizabeth saw him favor his injured arm, saw the strain showing on his face. "Getting tired, Breed," Coulter taunted, pressing his attack. "That arm slowing you down." As if in answer, White Eagle shifted his stance, switching his knife to his injured arm. Coulter, surprised by the change, left himself open for a heartbeat. It was enough. White Eagle's blade found its mark, slicing across Coulter's ribs, drawing first blood. The outlaw leader snarled and attacked with renewed fury. The two men grappled, rolling in the dust, each struggling for advantage. Elizabeth bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, every fiber of her being wanting to intervene but knowing she couldn't. Then Coulter did something that made the watching Lakota hiss with anger. He threw dirt in White Eagle's eyes and lunged while his opponent was blinded. His blade descended toward White Eagle's chest. But the warrior had been trained by people who knew every form of treachery, even blind. He rolled aside, and Coulter's knife drove into the earth where he had been. White Eagle's legs swept Coulter's feet from under him, and suddenly their positions were reversed. When the dust settled, White Eagle knelt over Coulter, knife at the outlaw's throat. The camp held its breath. "Yield!" White Eagle commanded. Coulter's eyes blazed with hatred, but the cold steel against his skin was persuasive. "I yield," he spat. White Eagle stood slowly, stepping back. "Take your men and go. Never return to these lands." For a moment, Elizabeth thought it was over. Then she saw Coulter's hand move to his boot, saw the hidden pistol emerge. "Look out!" she screamed. White Eagle spun, but Red Crow was already moving. The young warrior's rifle cracked, and Coulter jerked, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest with something like surprise. "Treacherous! To the end!" Coulter gasped, then toppled forward into the dust. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then one of Coulter's lieutenants went for his gun, and the night exploded into chaos. Elizabeth found herself pressed behind an overturned wagon as bullets filled the air like deadly hail. The medical supplies she needed to get to them. People would be hurt, dying. She started to move, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. White Eagle crouched beside her, a rifle in his hands. "Stay down," he ordered, then rose to fire at the outlaws. The battle was fierce but brief. The outlaws, demoralized by Coulter's death and facing determined defenders on ground they knew well, began to fall back. Some fled immediately. Others, trapped between their greed and their fear, fought to the bitter end. When the shooting finally stopped, the camp was littered with casualties from both sides. Elizabeth immediately went to work, her hands steady now that there was healing to be done. She bound wounds, extracted bullets, offered comfort to the dying regardless of which side they had fought on. "Why do you help them?" Red Crow asked, gesturing to a wounded outlaw she was tending. "They came to kill us." "Because I'm a healer," she replied simply, "and because someone has to break the cycle of violence." As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the grasslands gold and red, the cost became clear. 3 Lakota warriors had fallen, along with 8 outlaws, including Coulter. The surviving outlaws had been disarmed and sent away with a warning never to return. Elizabeth found White Eagle standing at the edge of camp, watching the sunrise. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, but he was whole. She moved beside him, and his arm came around her automatically. "It's not over," he said quietly. "There will be others, men who think like Coulter, who see my people as less than human, who will hate us for being together." "I know," Elizabeth replied. "But we're alive. We're together. We have people who will stand with us." She looked back at the camp, where Morning Star was organizing the women to prepare for the burial rites. "That's more than I had in Clearwater." He turned to study her face. "Do you regret your choice?" Elizabeth thought of the schoolhouse she had left behind, the safe, narrow life she could have lived. Then she looked at the man beside her, wounded but unbroken, gentle despite the violence he had been forced to embrace, bridging 2 worlds with grace and courage. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a moment." Standing Bear approached them, his expression grave but not unkind. "You fought well," he told White Eagle. "Both of you. You have proven that your bond is worth defending." He looked at Elizabeth. "You are welcome in our camp, not as a guest but as one of us, if you choose to stay." It was more than she had dared hope for acceptance, however tentative, from White Eagle's people. She felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded. "I choose to stay." As the camp began the sad work of honoring their dead, Elizabeth worked alongside the Lakota women, learning their ways, sharing their grief and their strength. The violence of the night had been terrible, the losses real and painful. But it had also forged something new, a place where she belonged, earned through blood and choice rather than birth. The frontier was still dangerous. Prejudice still poisoned hearts on all sides. And the future remained uncertain. But as she helped prepare the warriors for their final journey, as she felt the community slowly accepting her presence, as White Eagle's hand found hers in quiet moments, Elizabeth knew she had found something worth every risk. In this harsh land where survival meant strength and strength meant standing together, she had found her home at last. The town meeting had been called for sunset, but the crowd gathered early, their voices carrying across the dusty streets like the rumble of distant thunder. Elizabeth stood at the window of Sheriff Coleman's office, watching the townspeople file into the church that served as Clearwater's meeting hall. She had returned to town with White Eagle and several Lakota warriors to trade for supplies, only to find the community in upheaval. "They're scared," Coleman said from behind his desk, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. "Word of Coulter's death spread fast, but so did rumors. Some say you led him to the Lakota camp. Others claim the Indians are planning to attack the town in revenge for the raid." "That's absurd," Elizabeth replied, though she kept her voice level. "We came here in peace, to trade fairly as always." "I know that. You know that. But fear doesn't listen to reason." The sheriff stood, checking his pistol. "They're talking about turning White Eagle over to the authorities, claiming he murdered Coulter. Some of the hotheads want to go further, form a militia, drive all the Indians from the territory." Through the window, Elizabeth saw White Eagle emerging from the general store, flanked by Red Crow and another warrior named Stonehand. The crowd parted before them, but she could see the hostility in their faces, the hands hovering near weapons. "We should leave," she said, "before this gets worse." "Too late for that." Coleman nodded toward the church. "Jake Thompson's got them worked up good. He's been preaching about racial purity and manifest destiny all week. Says you're a traitor to your own kind." The church bell began to toll, calling the meeting to order. Elizabeth made a decision. "I'm going in there." "Miss Hartley, Elizabeth, that's not wise." "Maybe not, but hiding won't change their minds." She smoothed her dress, a simple calico that Morningstar had helped her make. "Someone needs to speak for reason." White Eagle was waiting outside, his face carefully neutral despite the hostile stares. "You should not go in there," he said quietly. "We've had this conversation before," she replied, managing a small smile. "I don't abandon fights that matter." Together, they entered the church, their presence causing an immediate stir. The pews were packed, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Jake Thompson stood at the pulpit, his face flushed with liquor and righteousness. "And here they are," Thompson announced. "The woman who chose savagery over civilization, and the heathen who corrupted her." "The only corruption I see," Elizabeth said, her clear voice cutting through the murmurs, "is in the hearts of those who preach hatred and fear." She walked down the aisle, White Eagle beside her, feeling the weight of every gaze. Some were hostile, others curious. A few she was surprised to see sympathetic. "You have no right to speak here," Thompson snarled. "You gave up that right when you took up with him." "I have every right," Elizabeth countered, reaching the front of the church. "I lived among you, taught your children, stood with you against outlaws, and when I showed compassion to a man who risked his life for this town, you cast me out. So tell me, Mr. Thompson, who truly abandoned civilization?" "Mrs." Walsh stood up in her pew. "The girl has a point. White Eagle fought against Coulter's gang when they attacked us. That counts for something in my book." "He's still an Indian," someone called out. "They can't be trusted." "Cannot be trusted," White Eagle spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I have traded fairly with this town for 3 years. I helped defend it against outlaws. I have never raised a hand except in defense. Yet you call me untrustworthy because of my blood. You killed Tom Coulter, Thompson accused. In fair combat, after he attacked a peaceful camp. White Eagle replied. After he threatened women and children. After he broke the terms of single combat and tried to shoot me in the back. Yes, he died. But not by my hand, by the hand of one defending against treachery. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward. I've investigated the matter. Witnesses from both sides confirm White Eagle's account. Coulter broke the rules of engagement. His death was the result of his own treachery. You taking their side now? Sheriff, Thompson's voice dripped contempt. I'm taking the side of truth and law. Coleman replied steadily. Same as always. The crowd began to fragment. Some nodding agreement with the sheriff, others muttering angrily. Elizabeth sensed the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Listen to yourselves, she said, raising her voice. You came to this land seeking freedom, opportunity, a new life. So did I. The Lakota, they were here first, but they've shown more willingness to coexist peacefully than many of you. We could build something here together, something better than the hatred and division of the East, but only if we choose to. Pretty words. Thompson sneered. But they won't change what you are, a race traitor, a woman who's forgotten her place. My place, Elizabeth said firmly, is standing for what's right. My place is beside the man I love, regardless of what others think. My place is helping to build a future where children like Mary Coleman can grow up without learning to hate based on skin color. Mary's father, Sheriff Coleman, cleared his throat. My daughter told me something the other day. Said Miss Hartley was the best teacher she ever had because she taught them to think, not just repeat what they were told. Maybe we should do some thinking now. An older rancher named William Hayes stood slowly. I've lived on this frontier for 20 years. Fought Indians, been fought by them, lost friends to raids, same as many of you, but I've also traded with them, learned from them, seen them care for their families just like we do. Maybe it's time we tried something different than endless fighting. The mood in the room began to shift, fear giving way to uncertainty, uncertainty to possibility. But Thompson wasn't finished. You fools, he shouted. You're letting a woman and a savage sweet-talk you into forgetting what these heathens are. They'll slaughter us in our beds. The only one talking about slaughter is you, Elizabeth observed. We came here to trade, nothing more. But you're so consumed with hatred that you see threats where none exist. Thompson's face purpled. I'll show you what I see. He reached for his gun. Several things happened at once. White Eagle moved to shield Elizabeth. Sheriff Coleman drew his own weapon, but it was Mrs. Walsh who ended it, bringing her heavy handbag down on Thompson's head with considerable force. That's enough of that nonsense, she announced as Thompson crumpled. I'm tired of grown men acting like rabid dogs. We have a choice here, keep living in fear and hatred, or try to build something better. I know which I choose. One by one, others began to speak. Some voiced lingering concerns, others tentative support. The debate continued for hours, sometimes heated but no longer violent. Elizabeth found herself answering questions about her time with the Lakota, dispelling myths, sharing truths. They're people, she said simply. Different customs, different beliefs, but people nonetheless. They laugh, they cry, they love their children, they mourn their dead. They want peace as much as we do, but peace with dignity, not subjugation. By the time the meeting ended, no grand resolution had been reached. The town remained divided, but something had shifted. The fear that Thompson had cultivated was no longer the only voice. Seeds of understanding had been planted, fragile but present. As they left the church, White Eagle took Elizabeth's hand. You were magnificent, he said quietly, a warrior with words instead of weapons. Words can be weapons too, she replied. But I prefer when they're tools for building bridges. Sheriff Coleman approached them. You're welcome to stay the night. My home is open to you both. It was a significant gesture. one that didn't go unnoticed by the dispersing crowd. Elizabeth saw some nod approval, others turn away in disgust. Change would not come overnight. "Thank you," White Eagle said, "but we should return. Our people will worry." As they prepared to leave town, Mrs. Walsh bustled up with a packed basket. "For the journey," she said gruffly, "and tell that morning star her remedy for joint pain works wonders." Elizabeth hugged the older woman impulsively. "Thank you for everything." "Bah! Someone needs to keep the menfolk from destroying everything with their foolishness." But her eyes were kind. "You take care of each other. The world needs more people willing to stand up for what's right." As they rode out of Clearwater, the town that had once rejected them, Elizabeth felt a mix of emotions. The meeting hadn't solved everything. Prejudice still poisoned many hearts. But they had faced the mob with truth instead of violence. And some had listened. "Do you think things will change?" she asked White Eagle as the town disappeared behind them. "Change is like water wearing away stone," he replied, "slow but inevitable. Today, we made the first crack." The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Elizabeth, but rather a reminder that even in this vast, sometimes hostile land, no one was truly alone. They had faced the trial of their own community and emerged, if not victorious, at least unbowed. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it together, with the strength that came from standing for truth in the face of fear, and love in the face of hate. The dawn came blood-red over the prairie, as if the sky itself knew what was coming. Elizabeth woke to the sound of war cries and gunfire, the peaceful morning shattered by violence. She scrambled from the teepee to find the camp in chaos, riders attacking from all directions. Not Coulter's scattered remnants, but a new threat, a combined force of outlaws and vengeful townsmen who had rejected the path of peace. "Elizabeth, get to safety," White Eagle shouted, already armed and mounting his horse. But there was no safety. The attackers had surrounded the camp completely, cutting off any escape route. The battle was brutal and desperate. These weren't the disorganized outlaws they had faced before, but men with military precision, led by someone who knew tactics. Elizabeth grabbed her medical supplies and her rifle White Eagle had taught her to shoot during their time together and took position behind an overturned wagon. Through the smoke and dust, she saw him Marcus Wade, a former Confederate officer turned bounty hunter, his gray coat still bearing military insignia. Thompson must have hired him after the town meeting, gathering those still poisoned by hate for this final assault. "Take no prisoners," Wade commanded, his saber flashing in the early light. "Cleanse this land of savages and traitors alike." The Lakota fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Elizabeth fired carefully, trying to wound rather than kill, but knowing that mercy might cost the lives of those she had come to love. She saw Red Crow fall, his chest blooming crimson. Stonehand went down beneath the hooves of cavalry horses. "The children!" Morning Star cried, and Elizabeth saw with horror that Wade's men were driving toward the center of camp where the non-combatants huddled. Without thinking, she broke cover, racing across the battlefield. A bullet tugged at her skirt. Another whined past her ear. But she reached the children and began herding them toward a ravine that offered some protection. Other women joined her, fighting with anything at hand: knives, cooking pots, raw courage. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than one. The Lakota were being pushed back, compressed into an ever smaller circle. Elizabeth saw White Eagle everywhere at once, rallying warriors, covering retreats, his rifle never missing. But even he couldn't be in all places. Stop all attacks. Then she saw Wade himself spurring toward the ravine where the children hid. His intentions were clear in his cold eyes: no survivors, no witnesses. Elizabeth stepped out to block his path, rifle raised. "Stop," she commanded. "These are children." Wade pulled up short, his lips curling in disdain. Children grow into savages, Missy, and traitors hang beside them. He raised his saber. Elizabeth fired, but her shot went wide. She had never killed a man before, and even now her hand shook. Wade's saber descended, and she threw herself aside. Feeling the blade whistle past, she hit the ground hard, rifle spinning from her grasp. Wade wheeled his horse for another pass, saber rising for the killing blow. Elizabeth scrambled for her weapon, knowing she wouldn't reach it in time. The children behind her screamed. The shot came from her left White Eagle, appearing like vengeance itself, his bullet taking Wade in the shoulder. The officer cursed and turned to face this new threat, and the two men charged each other across the smoke-filled battlefield. They collided with tremendous force, both going down in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Elizabeth retrieved her rifle and turned to defend the ravine, trusting White Eagle to handle Wade. Around her, the battle reached its crescendo of violence. Sheriff Coleman arrived with a posse of lawmen and decent townfolk, tipping the balance. "Stand down," he roared. "In the name of the law, cease fire." Some of Wade's men fled immediately. Others, caught up in bloodlust, continued fighting. Elizabeth saw Jake Thompson among them, his face twisted with hate as he shot at fleeing women. Without hesitation this time, she aimed and fired, watching him spin and fall. Gradually, the gunfire slackened and died. The smoke cleared to reveal a scene of devastation. Bodies littered the ground, Lakota warriors, outlaws, townsmen who had chosen hate over peace. The keening of grieving women rose like a physical thing. Elizabeth found White Eagle kneeling beside Wade's still form. The officer lived, but barely, his gray coat now truly crimson. "Why?" White Eagle asked quietly. "Why this hatred? Why this need for blood?" Wade coughed, specks of red on his lips. "Because you're in the way. This land belongs to white men. Civilization, progress." He laughed bitterly. "I fought a war for principles. Lost everything. This was supposed to be my redemption." "There is no redemption in murdering children," Elizabeth said, her voice hard as flint. Wade's eyes found hers. "You chose wrong side, woman. History will judge you." "Perhaps," she replied, "but I can live with history's judgment. Can you live with what you've done?" Wade had no answer. He died as the sun climbed higher, taking his hatred with him. The aftermath was a blur of grief and necessity. Elizabeth worked tirelessly, saving who she could, comforting the dying, helping prepare the dead for their journeys. The toll was terrible. 8 Lakota warriors, including Red Crow and Stonehand. 3 women, 1 child caught in crossfire. On the attacker's side, 15 dead including Wade and Thompson. Standing Bear, wounded but alive, surveyed the carnage with ancient eyes. "This is the price of hatred," he said. "Both sides bleed, both sides grieve, and the earth drinks it all the same." Sheriff Coleman, his posse helping tend wounded and gather weapons, approached Elizabeth and White Eagle. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I tried to stop them from organizing, but Thompson and Wade—" He shook his head. "There'll be an investigation, but it's clear this was an unprovoked attack. You defended yourselves." "Will that matter?" White Eagle asked, gesturing at the devastation. "Will your law bring back the dead?" "No," Coleman admitted. "But maybe it'll stop the next massacre. Maybe some will learn from this." As the day wore on, unexpected visitors arrived. Mrs. Walsh led a group of townswomen bearing medical supplies and food. William Hayes brought men to help with burials. Even some who had been uncertain at the town meeting came to offer aid. "This isn't right, Mrs." Walsh said, her usual stern demeanor cracked by tears as she helped tend a wounded child. "Whatever our differences, this isn't the way." The mass funeral took place at sunset. Lakota and white citizens of Clearwater stood together as the dead were honored, some in the Lakota way, others in Christian tradition. Elizabeth sang a hymn from her Philadelphia childhood. her voice breaking on the familiar words. White Eagle chanted a death song for the fallen warriors, the ancient sounds carrying across the prairie. Mary Coleman placed wildflowers on Red Crow's grave. He had taught her to track rabbits just the week before. Her father stood behind her, hat in hand, understanding perhaps for the first time that these were people, not abstractions to be feared or conquered. As night fell, Elizabeth and White Eagle stood apart from the others, looking out over the prairie that had seen too much blood. "Some will say we won," White Eagle said quietly. "Wade is dead, his men scattered, but this is no victory." "No," Elizabeth agreed, leaning against him for support. "There are no winners when hate drives men to such extremes." She looked back at the camp, where Lakota and townspeople worked side by side to restore order. But maybe, from this tragedy, seeds of understanding, he finished, watered with blood, as too many things are in this land. Sheriff Coleman approached them one last time. "There's talk in town of a treaty, a real one, with recognized boundaries and mutual defense agreements. Hayes and Mrs. Walsh are leading the effort." He paused. "It won't bring back the dead, but maybe it'll protect the living." It was a small hope in the face of so much loss, but Elizabeth clung to it. The battle had been won at terrible cost, but the deeper war against prejudice and fear continued. At least now, some were willing to fight it with words and laws rather than bullets. Standing beneath stars that had witnessed countless such tragedies, countless small hopes, Elizabeth knew that their struggle was far from over. But as White Eagle's arms encircled her, as she heard the mingled voices of Lakota and townspeople planning for tomorrow, she dared to believe that from this bloody ground, something better might yet grow. The frontier was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was also a place where change was possible, where people could learn to see beyond blood and birth to the common humanity beneath. It wasn't much to set against so much death, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Elizabeth had learned, were precious things in this land where endings came all too easily. The morning mist clung to the prairie grass as Elizabeth stood beside the rebuilt schoolhouse, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of gold and rose. 6 months had passed since the battle that had nearly destroyed everything. 6 months of slow healing and careful bridge building between the Lakota camp and Clearwater. The treaty Sheriff Coleman had spoken of was now reality, signed and witnessed, creating a formal peace between the town and the neighboring tribes. "The children will arrive soon," White Eagle said, joining her on the wooden steps. He wore a mixture of traditional Lakota clothing and frontier garb, a visual representation of the two worlds he continued to navigate. "Are you ready?" Elizabeth smiled, smoothing her simple dress. "As ready as one can be for teaching both Lakota and town children in the same classroom." It had been her idea. Part of the new understanding, a school where children from both communities could learn together, could grow up seeing each other as neighbors rather than enemies. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Standing Bear arrived with a group of Lakota children, their faces showing mixtures of excitement and nervousness. From the other direction came Mrs. Walsh with the town children, including Mary Coleman, who waved enthusiastically. "This is a brave thing you do," Standing Bear told Elizabeth. "To teach the young is to shape the future. May you shape it well." As the children filed into the schoolhouse, some segregating themselves by habit, others tentatively mingling, Elizabeth felt the weight of that responsibility. This was more than teaching arithmetic and letters. This was teaching a new generation to see beyond the prejudices that had cost so many lives. White Eagle squeezed her shoulder gently before stepping back. He would spend the day helping William Hayes and other ranchers establish new trading partnerships with the Lakota, another strand in the web of connection they were all trying to weave. The morning passed in a blur of introductions, lessons, and small breakthrough moments. When Tommy Morrison shared his lunch with Little Wolf, a Lakota boy his age. When Singing Bird helped Mary Coleman with a difficult sum. When the children, forgetting their parents' cautions, played together at recess as children do everywhere without thought of race or history. But not everyone celebrated these changes. As Elizabeth dismissed the class for lunch, she noticed riders approaching from the east. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle she kept beside her desk. The frontier had taught her hard lessons about vigilance. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, wearing the brass buttons of a federal official. Behind him rode soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the prairie backdrop. Elizabeth's heart sank. They had all known this day might come, the government's attention drawn by reports of Indian troubles and unconventional arrangements. "Miss Hartley," the official dismounted, producing documents from his saddlebag. "I'm James Patterson, Federal Commissioner for Indian Affairs. I understand you've been involved in local matters concerning the savages." "The Lakota," Elizabeth corrected firmly. "And yes, I've been involved in establishing peaceful relations between the communities." Patterson's thin lips pursed. "That's precisely the problem. There are proper channels for dealing with the Indian question. Treaties must be approved by Washington. Schools must follow federal guidelines." He gestured dismissively at the schoolhouse. "This mixing of races is against policy." "Whose policy?" White Eagle had returned, along with Sheriff Coleman and several townspeople who had seen the soldiers arrive. "The people here, both Lakota and white, have agreed to this arrangement." Patterson barely glanced at him. "The opinion of savages is not relevant to federal policy, and you, Miss Hartley, are in violation of numerous regulations, teaching without proper certification, living among hostiles, promoting dangerous ideas about racial equality." "Now hold on," Sheriff Coleman interjected. "Miss Hartley has done more for peace in this territory than a dozen federal commissioners. The arrangement works." "It's unnatural," Patterson declared, "and it ends now. The Indians will be relocated to designated reservation lands. This illegal school will be closed, and Miss Hartley will return east where she belongs, or face federal charges." The crowd that had gathered began to murmur angrily. "Mrs." Walsh pushed forward. "You can't just come in here and destroy what we've built. We've had peace for 6 months, real peace, not the kind enforced by soldiers." Patterson's hand moved to his sidearm. "I have full federal authority. Resist, and you'll all be considered in rebellion against the United States government." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Elizabeth saw hands moving toward weapons on both sides, saw the fear and anger in faces that had so recently learned to smile at each other. Everything they had worked for threatened to collapse into violence once again. "Wait," she said, stepping between Patterson and the crowd. "Commissioner Patterson, before you enforce your orders, would you do me the courtesy of seeing what you're destroying?" He frowned. "I don't see what—" "1 hour," Elizabeth pressed. "See our school in session. Meet the people you're calling savages, then make your decision." Patterson clearly wanted to refuse, but something perhaps the size of the crowd, perhaps simple curiosity, made him nod curtly. 1 hour. Elizabeth quickly gathered the children back into the schoolhouse. They sensed the tension, clustering nervously, but she smiled reassuringly. "We have a special visitor today. Let's show him what we've learned about living together." What followed was perhaps the most important hour of teaching in her life. The children, picking up on unspoken cues, rose to the occasion. They demonstrated their lessons, not just reading and arithmetic, but the cultural exchanges they had been making. Little Wolf taught the class Lakota words for family and friendship. Mary Coleman shared the story of how Red Crow had saved her father's life during a blizzard years ago. The children sang songs in both languages, their voices blending in innocent harmony. But it was young Thomas Whitehorse, son of a Lakota mother and white father, who provided the moment that changed everything. Standing before the federal commissioner, he spoke in clear, perfect English. "My mother says I am a bridge between two peoples. My father says I am the future. But I say I am just Thomas. And these are my friends. We learn together, play together, grow together. Why is that wrong?" Patterson stared at the boy. something flickering in his stern expression. "Your father is white." "John Whitehorse." The boy's father stepped forward from the crowd. "Former sergeant, 3rd Cavalry. Married my wife proper in a Christian ceremony. That boy's as American as you or me. Commissioner." Patterson looked around the room at the children of 2 races learning side by side, at the townspeople and Lakota standing together, at Elizabeth and White Eagle united in purpose, if not yet in law. For a long moment, he said nothing. "Finally," he sighed heavily. "I'll need to make a full report. There will be complications. Washington doesn't like exceptions to policy." He paused. "But I suppose, given the unique circumstances, a temporary exemption might be arranged, pending further review." The relief in the room was palpable. Patterson turned to leave, then stopped. "Miss Hartley, you should know that what you're attempting here, it goes against everything I was taught, everything I believed about the natural order." He met her eyes. "But perhaps it's time to examine those beliefs." As the Federal Party rode away, the crowd erupted in celebration. The treaty would hold. The school would continue. The fragile peace would have time to strengthen. It wasn't a complete victory. The threat of future federal interference remained, but it was enough for now. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Elizabeth and White Eagle walked hand in hand toward their favorite overlook. The landscape spread before them, harsh and beautiful, challenging and full of promise. "We'll face more challenges," White Eagle said quietly. "More men like Patterson, more fears to overcome." "I know," Elizabeth replied. "But today showed that change is possible. Those children, they're growing up in a different world than their parents knew. A better world. Perhaps." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder. "Morning Star has been teaching me the ceremony words," he said. "The proper way for a Lakota warrior to take a wife. And I've spoken with Reverend Mills in town about his ceremonies as well." Elizabeth's heart skipped. "Samuel White Eagle, are you proposing—" "I am proposing that we make official what has been true since you first stood between Thompson and me, with fire in your eyes and justice in your heart." He turned her to face him. "Will you marry me, Elizabeth Hartley? In both traditions, before both our peoples." "Yes," she said, tears blurring her vision. "Yes, to all of it. To you. To this life we're building. To the hope that love can bridge any divide." They kissed as the stars began to emerge, those eternal witnesses to all human struggles and triumphs. Below them, the lights of Clearwater mingled with the fires of the Lakota camp, 2 communities learning to become one. The frontier remained a dangerous place, where prejudice and violence always threatened. But here, in this small corner of the vast West, people had chosen a different path. They had proven that understanding could defeat fear, that love could conquer hate, that the future didn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. As Elizabeth and White Eagle made their way back to the camp that had become home, she thought of the journey that had brought her here. She had left Philadelphia seeking freedom and found something far greater purpose, community, and a love that transcended all boundaries. The West had tested her in ways she never imagined, had demanded courage she didn't know she possessed, but it had also given her gifts beyond measure. Under these vast skies, anything was possible, even a world where former enemies could become neighbors, where children of different races could learn together, where a woman from the East and a Lakota warrior could build a life founded on mutual respect and deep love. Their story was just beginning, but already it carried the seeds of a better tomorrow. And in the harsh, beautiful land of the American frontier, where hope was as precious as water and twice as hard to find, that was everything. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you enjoyed this story of love conquering prejudice on the frontier, please let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with fellow Western romance enthusiasts around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic stories of courage, romance, and adventure in America's untamed frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Elizabeth and Samuel's journey? We'd love to hear your perspective on their story.